My name is Isabella Ramirez. I'm 32 years old, and the night my older brother called me, the family's extra furniture, in front of everyone should have broken me. Instead, it destroyed a lie that had survived for decades. I stood beneath the warm string lights in my parents' backyard outside Denver, holding a glass of sparkling cider I hadn't touched. Laughter drifted across the patio, mixing with the smell of grilled steak and fresh flowers. It looked like something from a magazine. Then Adrian lifted his champagne glass. He smiled, the kind of smile that always came before one of his jokes. You know, he laughed, every family has stars. Then there are people like Bella. Reliable, quiet, always around. Great at helping, but not exactly built for big things. Several guests chuckled. They thought it was harmless. It wasn't that, it was the same insult I'd been hearing since childhood, polished into something people could mistake for humor. And just like every other time, my parents looked away. Neither one corrected him. Neither one ever had. But this time somebody else noticed. Claire, Adrian's fiancée, slowly turned toward me. Her smile faded. There was something strange in her eyes, something unsettled. Wait, she said softly. Adrian laughed. Trust me, babe. Bella's not exactly mysterious. But Claire ignored him. She kept staring at me. Not politely. Not casually. Like she was trying to remember something important. And suddenly, even Adrian noticed the change in her expression. Have we met before? She asked. The music, the conversations, the laughter around us seemed to disappear. For the first time that evening, my brother's confidence cracked. Because something told me Claire wasn't guessing. She was remembering. And once she remembered exactly where she'd seen me before. Nothing in that family would ever be the same. That my brother's name was Adrian Ramirez. And if you spent 5 minutes around him, you'd understand how he'd become the center of everyone's world. Adrian was 4 years older than me. And from the time we were children, people seemed to orbit around him without even realizing it. He had the kind of confidence that made strangers trust him instantly. He could walk into a room and somehow become the loudest voice without sounding rude. At least, not to anyone outside the family. We grew up in a traditional household where appearances mattered. My mother, Elena, loved stories she could proudly repeat to relatives. My father, Miguel, admired visible success, the kind people could point to and celebrate. Adrian knew exactly how to give them that. I was different. Quiet. Curious. The kind of child who listened more than she spoke. And in families like ours, quiet people often disappear in plain sight. Standing at that engagement party, I suddenly remembered a summer barbecue years earlier. Adrian had spent 3 months selling customized sneakers online, and made enough money to buy himself a watch. My father spent weeks telling neighbors that his son had the mind of an entrepreneur. That same month, I'd won a state science competition, and earned a scholarship to a prestigious academic program. Mom smiled, kissed my forehead and said, "That's wonderful, sweetheart." Then she asked Adrian if he wanted another burger. It wasn't cruelty. Not exactly. It was something quieter. Like being erased with a gentle hand. That became the pattern of my life. His victories became family celebrations. Mine became side notes. When he made junior varsity after failing the year before, we went out for dinner. When I graduated at the top of my class, everyone simply nodded and said they were proud. I told myself not to resent them. Because I loved my family. Children always do. Even when love arrives unevenly. But there was something else about Adrian. He didn't just enjoy attention. He needed it. And over the years, I began to realize something painful. The brighter I became, the harder he worked to keep me small. And by the time we reached adulthood, his jokes weren't jokes anymore. They were reminders. Reminders that in his world, I was supposed to stay in the background. By high school, the roles had already been assigned. Adrian was the charismatic one. I was the dependable one. Whenever relatives complimented my grades, he would smile and casually say, "Bella's brilliant, but she's not really built for pressure." Everyone laughed. They thought it was brotherly teasing. But I learned something very young. Cruelty wrapped in humor still leaves scars. When I was accepted into medical school, people congratulated me for all of 30 seconds before asking Adrian about his latest business idea. He loved that. He always had. And strangely enough, I let him. Not because I believed him. Because fighting for recognition had become exhausting. Have you ever spent years becoming someone extraordinary only to realize the people closest to you are still speaking to an older version of you? A smaller version. One that makes them comfortable. That was my life. And the older Adrian became, the more he seemed to need me to stay there. What nobody at that engagement party knew was that I had spent the last decade building a life that hardly anyone in my family understood. Most weeks, I stood beneath operating room lights for 12 hours at a time. I've held lives in my hands. I've spoken to terrified families when hope was hanging by a thread. I've walked out of surgeries with trembling legs and sweat soaking through my scrubs, wondering if I'd done enough to save someone. Yet somehow, my own family still believed I worked somewhere behind a desk. And that wasn't entirely their fault. Years earlier, after an exhausting 30-hour shift during my residency, I came home for Thanksgiving. An aunt asked what I actually did. "I'm training in neurosurgery," I said. She blinked. Oh. Then the conversation moved on. No questions. No curiosity. Nothing. That moment changed something inside me. I stopped explaining. If they didn't care enough to understand, I stopped offering pieces of myself. And over time, silence became easier. Until eventually, even Adrian started believing the version of me he had created. A version that was about to collapse. Because sometimes the truth stays hidden for years. And sometimes, all it takes is one person asking the right question. The strange thing about long silences is that eventually they start feeling normal. I told myself I preferred it that way. No explanations. No disappointment. No watching my accomplishments become props in Adrian's endless performances. So whenever I came home, I wore what I privately called my small version. I answered questions vaguely. I let assumptions live. And I let my brother tell stories that kept him comfortably above me. But silence comes with a price. There were nights after impossible surgeries when I'd sit alone in my apartment overlooking downtown Denver and wonder why complete strangers trusted me with their loved ones, while my own family barely knew who I was. My colleagues celebrated my promotions. The hospital board congratulated me after difficult cases. Meanwhile, my mother once texted me asking if I was still helping with hospital paperwork because a cousin wanted career advice. I laughed so hard I nearly cried. Not because it was funny, because it hurt. The only person who ever came close to uncovering the truth before the engagement party was Claire. Unlike Adrian, she actually listened. Months earlier, during a family dinner, she'd asked me detailed questions about medicine. Real questions. Not polite ones. Curious ones. I noticed the surprise in her eyes whenever I answered carefully, avoiding specifics. She'd looked at me strangely then, like someone staring at a puzzle missing only one piece. I should have realized the silence couldn't last forever, but people who spend years hiding inside other people's expectations start believing they control when the truth comes out. I thought I did. I thought I could choose the perfect moment. I was wrong. Because secrets don't always collapse when you're ready. Sometimes they collapse because one person notices what everyone else ignored. And as I sat beneath those glowing lights while Adrian entertained his guests, I had no idea that Claire was only seconds away from remembering exactly where she'd seen me. And once she did, the life my brother had spent years carefully building was about to crack right in front of everyone. Adrian loved attention. The engagement party had been planned down to the smallest detail. White roses covered the tables. Soft music drifted through the backyard. Crystal glasses reflected the warm lights hanging above us. Everything looked perfect. And Adrian loved perfect. Throughout the evening, he'd made little comments about me. Nothing obvious. Nothing cruel enough to start a fight. Just enough to remind everyone where he thought I belonged. "Bella's amazing with organization," he'd joked to one guest. "She's dependable. Not ambitious like me, but dependable." Later he laughed and added, "Every successful person needs someone practical around." Everyone smiled. Everyone moved on. Everyone except Claire. I noticed her watching me. Not him. Me. Her expression kept changing. Confusion. Recognition. Disbelief. Then, after Adrian's latest joke, she slowly put down her fork. "No," she said quietly. The table fell silent. Adrian chuckled. What? Claire ignored him. She looked directly at me. Her eyes widened. Oh my God. My brother laughed nervously. Babe, what's wrong? She never looked away from me. That's impossible. I frowned. Claire. Suddenly she stood up. Her chair scraped against the patio stones, and every conversation nearby stopped. You. She whispered. Her voice shook. I know you. Adrian forced a smile. Sweetheart, you've met Bella 100 times. No, she said, almost breathless. Not like this. She stared at me as if she'd just seen a ghost. And then it hit me. I remembered. 2 years earlier. Emergency surgery. A 63-year-old man with a severe brain hemorrhage. And outside the operating room, a terrified daughter. Red eyes. Hands shaking. Praying. Claire. The memory flashed through my mind at the exact moment tears filled her eyes. You saved my father, she whispered. And just like that, the laughter disappeared. The music faded. And for the first time in his life, Adrian's smile completely vanished. You saved my father. Claire's voice was barely above a whisper, but it felt louder than the music that had been playing moments earlier. Every conversation around the table stopped. Adrian blinked. What are you talking about? He asked with a nervous laugh. Claire never looked at him. She was staring at me, tears gathering in her eyes. 2 years ago, she said softly. Denver General. Dad had a massive brain bleed. They told me he might not survive the night. And suddenly, I remembered everything. The emergency transfer. The endless hours under the operating lights. And outside the operating room, a young woman sitting alone in the waiting area, clutching a paper cup with both hands because they were shaking too hard. Claire. I remember, I said gently. The tears she had been holding back finally escaped. You came out after the surgery yourself, she said. You sat beside me because I couldn't stop crying. You explained everything when nobody else had time. She smiled through her tears. You told me hope wasn't a promise, but it was enough to keep fighting. I barely remembered saying it. For me, it had been one difficult night among hundreds. For her, it had changed everything. You saved my father, she repeated. He got to see me graduate. He got to walk me down the aisle someday, or at least that was supposed to happen. Several guests exchanged confused looks. One of Adrian's friends frowned. Wait, Bella's a doctor. Before I could answer, Claire shook her head. Not just a doctor. She looked around the table. She's Dr. Isabella Ramirez, the neurosurgeon who operated on my father. The silence became suffocating. My mother's hand covered her mouth. My father looked like all the color had drained from his face. And across from me, Adrian sat frozen. Because for the first time in his life, he wasn't the center of everyone's attention. And he had absolutely no idea what to say. Nobody spoke. Not immediately. The kind of silence that settled over the table wasn't awkward. It was heavy, confused, almost unreal. My mother sat motionless, her eyes wide with disbelief. My father stared at me as though he were looking at a stranger he'd somehow known his entire life. And Adrian forced a laugh. It sounded hollow. Okay, hold on, he said, smiling too quickly. Bella, you never told anybody that. Claire slowly turned toward him. She tried, she replied quietly. He blinked. What? She tried, Adrian. Her voice wasn't angry. That made it worse. I asked questions during dinners. I brought up medicine. I listened. You interrupted her every single time. Nobody moved. Nobody defended him. For once, there were no laughs to hide behind. No, that's ridiculous, Adrian snapped. If she was some famous surgeon, why would she keep it secret? I looked at him calmly. Because I got tired. His smile disappeared. Tired of what? Tired of explaining myself to people who never cared enough to ask. His face tightened. That's unfair. Is it? I wasn't angry anymore. That surprised even me. I came home after 30-hour shifts, Adrian. I talked about residency. Nobody listened. I mentioned neurosurgery years ago. Everyone changed the subject. My father's eyes slowly lowered. My mother wiped tears from her face. And Claire spoke again. She sat with me for 40 minutes after my dad's surgery. Her voice cracked. She didn't know me. She didn't owe me anything. But she stayed because I was scared. Then Claire looked at Adrian. And all this time, you've been introducing her like she's your assistant. The words hit him harder than anyone expected. Because for the first time that night, people weren't looking at me. They were looking at him. And suddenly, being the center of attention didn't seem nearly as enjoyable anymore. The atmosphere around the table shifted. Not suddenly. Not dramatically. But slowly, like a room realizing it had misunderstood something important for a very long time. One of Adrian's business friends leaned forward. "Wait a second," he said carefully. "Dr. Isabella Ramirez?" I nodded politely. His eyebrows shot up. "I've heard that name before." Another guest looked at him. "The one who spoke at the neurological conference last year?" I smiled awkwardly. "That was me." My father's eyes widened. "You gave speeches?" Before I could answer, Claire laughed softly through her tears. "She doesn't just give speeches. My father's neurologist called her one of the best surgeons he'd ever worked with." My mother looked completely lost. "The best?" she whispered. And that's when I realized something strange. They weren't shocked because I was successful. They were shocked because they'd never bothered to know me. Adrian suddenly stood up. "Oh, come on," he snapped. "This is ridiculous. Everyone's acting like I've done something horrible." Nobody answered. He looked around desperately. She never corrected anyone. Still no response. Then his cousin Daniel spoke quietly. "Would you have listened?" Adrian froze. "What?" Daniel shrugged. "Honestly, Mend, would you have?" For the first time all evening, Adrian had no joke. No smile. No performance. Then one of his investors, Eric, slowly set his wine glass down. "Actually," he said. Everyone turned. Eric's expression had changed. "Adrian, your pitch deck mentioned that your sister worked closely with hospital operations and provided clinical insights." My brother's face went pale. "It wasn't like that." Eric frowned. "It sounded exactly like that." The backyard became completely silent again. Because suddenly, this wasn't about family anymore. And judging by the look on Eric's face, something much bigger had just entered the conversation. Eric wasn't a relative. He wasn't someone who cared about family drama. He cared about facts. And the expression on his face told me he'd just remembered something he didn't like. "Adrian," he said slowly, "you told us your sister's medical connections helped shape your healthcare platform." Adrian swallowed. "Well, she works in hospitals." "That's not what you implied." Eric's voice remained calm, which somehow made it worse. "You presented it as if you had direct access to specialists and frontline expertise through her." Several guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. Adrian forced a laugh. "You're twisting things." "No," Eric replied. "I'm remembering things." Another investor beside him nodded. "I remember that too." Suddenly, Adrian looked trapped. "This is unbelievable," he muttered. "Everyone's turning on me over nothing." Claire stood up. "Nothing." Her eyes were red, but her voice was steady. "You spent years reducing your own sister to a joke." He turned toward her. "Claire, not you too." "No, Adrienne. Especially me." Everyone fell silent. "My father is alive because of her." She pointed gently toward me. "And tonight I watched you call that woman useless." Adrian shook his head. "It was a joke." "No," Claire answered. "It was a habit." That sentence hit harder than shouting ever could. Because she was right. It wasn't one joke. It wasn't one bad night. It was years. Years of small insults disguised as humor. Years of keeping someone else small to feel bigger. And for the first time, people weren't laughing. They were remembering. Remembering every comment. Every interruption. Every dismissive smile. I sat quietly, watching something I had never expected. Not revenge. Not victory. Recognition. And then my father finally spoke. His voice sounded older than I had ever heard it. "Adrian." Everyone looked at him. My father stared at his son with disappointment in his eyes. And in a voice barely above a whisper, he asked the question nobody had ever asked before. Why were you so afraid of your sister? My father's question hung in the air. Not angry, not loud, just painfully honest. Why were you so afraid of your sister? Adrian stared at him. Afraid, he repeated. Dad, that's ridiculous. But nobody rushed to defend him. Not Mom. Not Claire. Not even himself. My father slowly shook his head. Son, I spent years believing confidence was your greatest strength. He looked toward me. Now I'm wondering if it was insecurity. Adrian's face reddened. So everybody's against me now? No, Claire said quietly. We finally stopped pretending. That hurt him. I could see it. Not because she raised her voice. Because she didn't. For years, Adrian had survived by turning everything into a performance. But performances only work when people keep applauding. And nobody was applauding anymore. Then my mother began crying. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Silent tears. She looked at me with trembling eyes. Why didn't you tell us? She whispered. I smiled sadly. I did, Mom. Her face crumpled. No. Yes. I wasn't angry. Just tired. I told everyone years ago. I remembered Thanksgiving after residency. Christmas dinners. Phone calls. Mom asking if I still worked in administration. Dad telling relatives Adrian was the ambitious one. And every time I tried to explain, someone interrupted. Eventually I stopped trying. My father lowered his head. As if memories were returning all at once. Then Eric cleared his throat. Adrian, we need to talk next week. Adrian looked up immediately. What? The board needs clarification. His voice remained professional. And honestly, this whole evening raises questions. Questions. Not accusations. Not threats. Just questions. Yet somehow, those questions terrified my brother more than anything else. Because deep down, Adrian knew something dangerous. Lies don't usually collapse because people discover the truth. They collapse because people start asking the right questions. And judging by the fear in his eyes, he knew this night wasn't over. In fact, it was only the beginning. Nobody said much after that. The party continued, at least on the surface, but the laughter never fully returned. Conversations became whispers. Guests kept glancing toward our table before pretending they weren't. Adrian disappeared inside the house. Claire sat quietly beside me, occasionally wiping tears from her eyes. I'm sorry, she whispered. For what? I asked gently. For not seeing it sooner. I squeezed her hand. You listened. That's more than most people ever did. Across the yard, my parents sat in silence. For the first time in my life, they looked less like authority figures and more like two exhausted people confronting years they couldn't undo. Eventually, the guests left. No dramatics shouting. No broken glasses. Just uncomfortable goodbyes. But life has a strange way of saving its hardest conversations for later. 3 days afterward, my mother called. Her voice sounded fragile. We'd like you to come over Sunday. I knew immediately what it was. Not brunch. Not family time. A reckoning. When I arrived, Adrian was already there. Pacing. He wore an expensive sweater, but somehow it looked different now. Not impressive. Like armor that no longer fit. Dad sat quietly at the table. Mom's eyes were swollen from crying. And unexpectedly, Claire was there too. No engagement ring. No esmail. Just calm sadness. Adrian looked up when I entered. Bella, he began. But Claire interrupted him. Before anyone says anything, there's something everyone should see. She unlocked her phone and placed it in the center of the table. Dad adjusted his glasses. Mom leaned forward. And I noticed Adrian suddenly stop breathing. On the screen was an email thread. At the top, one sentence stood out clearly. Due diligence review has been temporarily suspended. And judging by the color draining from my brother's face, he already knew exactly what was coming next. The room went completely still. Claire didn't say a word. She simply turned the phone around so everyone could read it. Dad adjusted his glasses. Mom covered her mouth. One email after another. Concerns regarding founder integrity. Requests for clarification on professional representations. Investment review paused pending further discussions. Nobody had to explain what it meant. Adrian sank into his chair. Those are misunderstandings, he muttered. Claire looked at him sadly. Are they? He rubbed his forehead. I never lied. Eric's message was visible on the screen. Several statements regarding your clinical access and advisory resources require clarification. My father slowly exhaled. You used your sister's work? Adrian shook his head. No. Not like that. Then how? Dad asked quietly. For the first time in his life, Adrian had no speech prepared. No yoke. No esmail. Nothing. Claire finally spoke. You kept mentioning medical insight, frontline experience, access to specialists. She looked directly at him. You knew exactly what people would assume. Mom began crying again. Adrian, why? He stood up suddenly. Because I needed credibility. The words escaped before he could stop them. Everyone froze. His breathing became uneven. My competitors had advisors and connections. I needed people to believe in me. He looked toward me. And Bella never said anything. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny. Because somehow, even now, he was searching for someone else to blame. Claire's eyes filled with disappointment. No, Adrienne. Her voice was barely above a whisper. She protected you. That sentence hit harder than anger. Because it was true. I had stayed silent. Not out of fear. Not out of shame. But because I loved my family enough to avoid humiliating them. And suddenly, my brother looked smaller than I'd ever seen him. Not because his business was falling apart. But because for the first time in his life, everyone around him could finally see the difference between confidence and insecurity. And then his phone began ringing. He looked at the screen. And all the color drained from his face. The phone kept vibrating against the table. Adrian stared at the screen like it had become something dangerous. He declined the call. 2 seconds later, it rang again. Same number. His hand trembled as he finally answered. Hello. The voice on the other end was loud enough for all of us to hear. Adrian, where the hell have you been? Everyone's pulling out. His face turned pale. Steve, not now. No, right now. Harrison Capital is gone. Westbridge is gone. And after Eric called this morning, nobody wants to touch this deal. Mom froze. Dad slowly lowered his eyes. Steve, please. Please what? Explain why people think you exaggerated your access to medical experts? Explain why we're finding out about this from investors instead of you. Adrian's breathing became shallow. It wasn't like that. Then tell me what it was like. Silence. Painful silence. Steve sighed heavily. You know what? Forget it. We're done. Everyone's done. The line went dead. Nobody moved. Adrian sat down slowly, staring at the dark phone screen. This can't be happening, he whispered. And strangely enough, I didn't feel victorious. I had imagined this moment differently over the years. I thought I would enjoy seeing him humbled. I thought it would heal something inside me. But revenge in fantasies is clean. Reality isn't. Reality looked like my mother quietly crying. Reality looked like my father staring at the table with regret written all over his face. Reality looked like my brother, who had spent his whole life trying to be admired, sitting there terrified because admiration was all he'd ever learned to value. And then Claire spoke. Not with anger. Not with cruelty. With sadness. Adrian, she said softly. Do you even know who you are when nobody's impressed by you? He looked up at her, and for the first time since I'd known him, he didn't have an answer. And somehow, that silence hurt more than everything else that had happened. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Claire's question lingered in the room like smoke. Do you even know who you are when nobody's impressed by you? Adrian opened his mouth, then closed it. Because for the first time in his life, charm couldn't save him. He looked around desperately, almost like he expected someone to step in and rescue him. Nobody did. Not Mom. Not Dad. Not me. Claire slowly removed her engagement ring and placed it on the table. The sound it made against the wood seemed impossibly loud. Adrian's eyes widened. Claire. Tears filled her eyes, but her voice remained calm. I love you, she said softly. Or at least, I loved the man I thought you were. He stood up immediately. Please don't do this. She shook her head. I'm not leaving because your company is struggling. Her voice cracked. I'm leaving because I watched you humiliate your own sister without blinking. I watched you dismiss the woman who saved my father's life. Adrian's face collapsed. Claire, I can fix this. No, she whispered. You can change. Maybe. But trust isn't something you fix overnight. My mother began sobbing. Dad closed his eyes. And suddenly, Adrian looked 10 years older. Not angry. Not defensive. Broken. He sat back down heavily. I never wanted this, he whispered. No, my father said quietly. But you wanted admiration so badly that you stopped caring how you got it. Adrian covered his face with both hands. And then something happened that I had never seen before. My father looked at my mother and said in a voice full of regret, We did this. Mom looked up. He swallowed hard. We taught him that being impressive mattered more than being kind. Silence filled the room. And for the first time in decades, nobody was blaming anyone else. Everyone was finally looking at the truth. And truth, I would soon learn, is painful. But it can also be the beginning of something none of us expected. Nobody left immediately. Nobody knew how. The room had become too quiet for easy escapes. Adrian sat motionless, staring at the engagement ring lying on the table. He looked like a man who had spent his whole life climbing a mountain only to discover it was leaning against the wrong wall. Finally he spoke. What do I do now? No one answered. Because there wasn't a simple answer. Not this time. My father leaned forward and folded his hands. You stop performing, he said quietly. Adrian looked up. You stop trying to impress people and start learning how to be honest. Mom wiped her eyes. We should have taught you that years ago. Claire stood up. She wasn't angry anymore. That somehow hurt more. I need time, she said softly. And you need help. Adrian's voice broke. So that's it. No, she answered. That's reality. Then she turned to me. And to my surprise, she hugged me. Not because I had saved her father. Not because of my career. But because she understood what it felt like to love someone who kept hurting themselves and everyone around them. I'm sorry, Bella, she whispered. I hugged her back. None of this was your fault. She smiled sadly and walked toward the door. Adrian watched her leave. And for the first time in his life, he didn't chase after her. Maybe because he knew. Maybe because he finally understood that some losses can't be argued away. After she left, he looked at me. Not as his little sister. Not as the background character he'd spent years creating. But as a person. His eyes were red. And his voice was barely a whisper. Bella. I don't know how to apologize for 20 years. I looked at him quietly. Because the truth was. Neither did I. And what he said next was something I never expected to hear from my brother. I think I'm scared of who I become when nobody's watching. And for the first time since we were children, I believed he was telling the truth. For a long moment nobody spoke. My brother's words stayed in the air. I think I'm scared of who I become when nobody's watching. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't polished. It was just honest. And somehow, honesty sounded strange coming from Adrian. My father nodded slowly. That's the first real thing I've heard from you in years. Adrian lowered his eyes. I don't know how to fix any of this. You don't, I answered quietly. He looked at me. You don't fix 20 years with one apology. You don't erase humiliation because you suddenly feel guilty. His shoulders sagged. I know. No, I continued gently. You learn. You change. And then you keep changing when nobody's giving you credit for it. Tears rolled down my mother's face again. I'm sorry, Bella, she whispered. I miss so much. I smiled sadly. We all did. Dad stood up and walked over to me. My father wasn't a man who hugged often. Growing up, affection usually came through advice or hard work. But that morning, he wrapped his arms around me and held on longer than he ever had before. I'm proud of you, he whispered. Not because of the awards. Not because of the surgeries. Just because you became a good woman. I nearly cried. Because after all those years, those simple words meant more than I expected. Meanwhile, Adrian sat silently. No excuses. No jokes. No speeches. Just silence. And for once, I didn't hate the silence. Because this one felt different. This silence wasn't neglect. It wasn't indifference. It was reflection. As I prepared to leave, Adrian stood up. Bella. I turned. He swallowed hard. Would you give me a chance? I studied his face. The arrogance was gone. The confidence too. What remained was simply my brother. And I answered honestly. That depends on what you do next. Because forgiveness isn't built with promises. It's built with patterns. And only time would tell which version of Adrian Ramirez would survive once nobody was watching anymore. Life didn't transform overnight. Movies like to pretend that one emotional conversation fixes everything. Real life doesn't work that way. For the next few weeks, I buried myself in work. Long surgeries. Endless rounds. Families holding on to hope. It was easier to focus on strangers than on my own family. And strangely enough, nobody pushed me. Not Mom. Not Dad. Not even Adrian. Then one evening, I received a message from him. Not a speech. Not a request. Just 3 words. Hope you're okay. No mention of himself. No explanations. No guilt. I stared at the screen for almost a minute before replying. Long day. I've fine. His answer came hours later. Get some sleep. That was it. Weeks turned into months. Mom started calling just to ask how I was feeling, not what I was doing. Dad attended one of my hospital lectures. He stood quietly in the back of the room afterward, looking around like he was trying to understand how much of my life he had missed while standing right beside me. Then one afternoon, he hugged me and whispered, I wish I'd asked more questions. And I believed him. As for Adrian, his world became much smaller. The luxury apartment disappeared. The expensive car disappeared. Most of his business partners disappeared. But something unexpected happened. He stopped talking about what he'd lost. Instead, he started asking questions. Real questions. How was surgery? Did difficult cases keep me awake? Was I eating enough? At first, the conversations felt awkward. Like strangers trying to remember they were siblings. But slowly, something began growing between us. Not trust. Trust takes time. Something smaller. Respect. And perhaps that mattered more. Because for the first time in our lives, my brother wasn't trying to shine brighter than me. He was simply trying to become better than the man he used to be. And 6 months later, he would do something none of us expected. Something that left our entire family speechless. 6 months later, my parents celebrated their 35th wedding anniversary. Nothing extravagant. Just family. A few relatives. A quiet dinner in the same backyard where everything had fallen apart. I almost didn't go. Part of me worried the old patterns would return. But when I arrived, something felt different. There were no performances. No loud stories. No need for anyone to be the center of attention. Dad grilled steaks while Mom laughed with my cousins. And Adrian? He was setting plates. Not directing people. Not entertaining. Just helping. He looked healthier somehow. Not richer. Not happier exactly. Lighter. Halfway through dinner, Dad stood to give a toast. He smiled at Mom. 35 years, he said softly. Not perfect years. But real ones. Everyone raised their glasses. Then Dad sat down. And Adrian stood. My stomach tightened. Old instincts. Old memories. But Adrian unfolded a piece of paper. His hands were shaking. If I try to improvise, he said quietly, I'll probably hide behind jokes. Nobody spoke. He looked directly at me. For most of my life, I convinced myself that admiration mattered more than kindness. His voice trembled. And because of that, I spent years making my sister smaller, so I could feel bigger. My mother started crying immediately. I called her ordinary. He swallowed hard. I laughed when people overlooked her. He looked at our relatives. And at my engagement party, I publicly humiliated one of the most compassionate people I've ever known. His eyes met mine. Dr. Isabella Ramirez has saved lives. His voice cracked. And I worked very hard to make sure this family noticed me more than her. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. Then Adrian folded the paper, and for the first time in my life, my brother looked at me not as competition, not as a supporting character, but simply as his sister, and with tears in his eyes he whispered, "I'm sorry, Bella." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was something much harder, and much more beautiful. It was truth. That apology didn't magically heal 20 years. People like to believe forgiveness arrives in one beautiful moment. It doesn't. Healing is quieter than that. After everyone left, I sat alone beneath the string lights, staring at the empty chairs scattered across the backyard. Adrian walked over slowly. No audience. No relatives. Just us. "You didn't say anything," he said softly. I smiled. "What did you expect me to say?" He laughed nervously. "I don't know. Maybe that everything's okay now." I looked up at him. "It isn't." His smile faded. "I know." For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he sat down beside me. "Claire was right, you know." "About what?" "About not knowing who I am when nobody's impressed by me." He stared at his hands. "My whole life, I thought being admired meant being valuable." I remained quiet. "And every time you succeeded, I felt smaller. Not because of anything you did. Because I knew how hard you worked, and I hated how effortless people thought my life was." I looked at him carefully. For once, there was no jealousy in his voice. Only regret. "You know what the worst part is?" he whispered. "What?" "I wasn't afraid that you'd fail." His eyes filled with tears. "I was afraid you'd shine so brightly that people would finally realize how average I felt." Those words broke my heart. Not because they excused him, because they explained him. I reached over and squeezed his hand. "You know something funny?" He looked up. "I spent years thinking you hated me." He shook his head immediately. "No." His voice cracked. "I loved you, Bella." He laughed bitterly. "I just didn't know how to love someone I envied." And suddenly, I understood something. The enemy in our family had never been success. It had never been ambition. It had been comparison. And comparison had stolen years from both of us. But at least now, we were finally talking like brother and sister. Not competitors. Not strangers. Family. And sometimes, that's where healing begins. Healing didn't happen all at once. It happened in phone calls, in awkward conversations, in small moments nobody would ever post online. Months later, Mom stopped introducing me as Adrian's sister. Instead, she'd smile proudly and say, "This is my daughter, Isabella." Not because of my career, but because she had finally learned to see me. Dad changed too. Whenever we spoke, he asked questions. Real questions. How was I sleeping? Did certain cases stay with me? Was I taking care of myself? One evening after a hospital fundraiser where I had given a lecture, I found him standing near the back wall long after everyone else had left. "You know," he said quietly, "I spent years thinking I knew my children." His eyes grew wet. But I only knew the stories I'd created. He looked ashamed. "I miss so much." I hugged him. So did I. As for Adrian, rebuilding his life wasn't glamorous. There were no headlines. No applause. He moved into a small apartment. Started consulting part-time. Went to therapy. Something the old Adrian would have mocked. And little by little he stopped trying to impress people. One afternoon, he called me after one of my surgeries. "How'd it go?" he asked. "Long day." "Did you save them?" I smiled. "We did." There was silence. Then he laughed softly. "I still forget you're amazing." I laughed. "And I still forget you're allowed to say nice things." For the first time in years, our conversations felt easy. Not perfect. Not healed completely. Just honest. And maybe honesty was enough, because redemption isn't one speech. It isn't tears. It isn't regret. It's repetition. It's choosing to become better when nobody's watching. And whether that change lasts forever, only time can answer. But one thing I know for certain. I no longer make myself smaller to keep others comfortable. And strangely enough, the moment I stopped shrinking, everyone around me finally learned how to see me. People often ask me if I ever regretted staying silent for so many years. The answer surprises them. No. I regret believing silence was the same thing as peace. They're not. Peace protects your soul. Silence sometimes protects other people's comfort. And I had confused the two for most of my life. About a year after the engagement party, I found myself standing in another waiting room. Not as a surgeon. Not as Dr. Isabella Ramirez. Just as a daughter. My father had needed a minor procedure. Nothing life-threatening. But sitting there, watching the clock and pretending not to worry, I suddenly understood something I had seen in hundreds of families. Fear makes people honest. Dad noticed me staring at the floor and smiled. Funny, isn't it? He said. What? For years, I thought I was protecting this family by keeping everyone happy. I smiled sadly. And he chuckled softly. I was protecting my comfort, not my family. Those words stayed with me. Because maybe that's what we all had been doing. Mom had protected appearances. Dad had protected harmony. Adrian had protected his ego. And I had protected everyone else's feelings. None of us had been protecting the truth. After his procedure, we stopped by a small diner on the way home. Nothing fancy. Just coffee and pie. Adrian met us there straight from work. He looked tired. Normal. Human. Not polished. Not impressive. And as we laughed over some ridiculous story Mom was telling, I caught myself smiling. Not because everything had been fixed, but because something far more valuable had happened. We had stopped pretending. And maybe that's what family really is. Not people who never hurt you, but people willing to confront the hurt honestly. As we stood to leave, Dad wrapped an arm around both of us and smiled. My kids, he said proudly. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel invisible. I felt home. Years later, people still remembered the night everything changed. Some remembered the revelation. Some remembered the apology. But I remembered something else. The silence afterward. Because silence no longer frightened me. It had become peaceful. One evening after a particularly difficult surgery, I stood by the large windows of my office watching the city lights below. My phone buzzed. It was Adrian. Dinner tomorrow? I smiled. Simple. No emergencies. No guilt. Just a brother asking his sister to eat. When I arrived at the restaurant the next day, he was already there. Nothing expensive. Nothing flashy. Just a quiet little Italian place. He looked up and smiled. You know, he said, I used to think success meant everyone looking at me. I laughed. And now? He shrugged. Now I think success is having people who answer when I call. I smiled. That's progress. He grinned. My therapist says that too. We both laughed. Halfway through dinner, he reached into his wallet and handed me something. I frowned. What is this? A picture. I looked down. It was an old photo of us as kids. I couldn't have been older than 8. He was 12. In the picture, I was holding on to his arm and smiling like he hung the moon. I found it while moving, he said quietly. I realized something. What? His eyes became emotional. You always loved me. I swallowed hard. And I spent years trying to compete with the one person who never wanted to beat me. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Then he smiled sadly. I wasted so much time. I squeezed his hand. No. He looked surprised. You finally stopped. Outside, the sun was setting. And for the first time since we were children, there was no audience. No comparisons. No need to prove anything. Just 2 siblings sharing dinner. And honestly, that felt bigger than all the applause in the world. A few months later, I received an invitation that made me smile before I even opened it. Adrian Ramirez and Associates. Not a startup launch. Not a networking event. Not another attempt to impress investors. It was an invitation to the opening of his small consulting office. Nothing extravagant. No luxury downtown building. No champagne towers. Just a modest office above a bookstore. And somehow, I was more proud of him than I had ever been. Mom arrived carrying flowers. Dad wore the same suit he'd owned for years, and somehow looked happier than I'd seen him in decades. When I stepped inside, Adrian hugged me immediately. Not because people were watching. Because he wanted to. I almost canceled this, he admitted. Why? He laughed nervously. Old habits. I kept thinking it wasn't impressive enough. I smiled. And then I remembered something my therapist told me. He pointed around the room. Build something real, not something that looks impressive. Dad chuckled. Smart therapist. Adrian laughed. Smarter than me. Then I noticed something framed on his desk. Not awards. Not certificates. That old childhood picture. The one where I was holding his arm and smiling like he was my hero. I looked at him. You kept it. His eyes softened. Yeah. He smiled. It reminds me that I had someone cheering for me long before I deserved it. I felt tears forming. Not because life had become perfect, but because people can change. Not always. Not everyone. But sometimes. As everyone gathered for a simple photo, Mom suddenly looked at us and started crying again. Dad laughed. Maria, not again. She wiped her eyes and smiled. I'm sorry. Then she looked at both of us. I spent years praying for successful children. She shook her head. I should have been praying for good ones. And standing there beside my brother, I realized something beautiful. Success had never saved our family. Humility did. And without knowing it, life was preparing us for one final lesson neither of us would ever forget. 2 years after everything changed, life taught us one final lesson. It came quietly. No parties. No dramatic speeches. Just a phone call at 6:30 on a rainy Tuesday morning. Mom's voice was shaking. Your father collapsed. I don't remember the drive to the hospital. I only remember fear. Not the kind I felt inside operating rooms. Not the controlled kind. The helpless kind. By the time I arrived, Adrian was already there. Standing alone in the waiting room. Terrified. He looked up, and without saying a word, hugged me tighter than he ever had. Dad's going to be okay, right? He whispered. For a second, I wasn't Dr. Isabella Ramirez. I was just someone's daughter. And I didn't know. Hours passed. Mom prayed softly. Adrian paced. I sat quietly, staring at the floor, feeling exactly like the families I'd comforted for years. Finally, the doctor came out. Nothing life-threatening. Stress. Exhaustion. Dad would recover completely. Mom burst into tears. Adrian nearly collapsed with relief. And when they finally wheeled Dad into his room, he smiled weakly. Look at you two. His voice was rough. You both look terrible. We laughed through tears. Then Dad reached out and grabbed our hands. When I thought I might not wake up, he said softly, I didn't think about money. He looked at Adrian. I didn't think about success. Then he looked at me. I thought about this. His eyes filled with tears. My family. Nobody spoke. Because we understood. Life had stripped away the titles, the awards, the comparisons. And what remained was enough. More than enough. As we sat together in that hospital room, Adrian squeezed my shoulder and smiled. You know something, Bella? What? He laughed quietly. I think we finally became the family we spent our whole lives pretending to be. And for the first time in years, nobody disagreed. Dad retired 6 months later. Not because he had to, because he wanted to. He said surviving that scare had changed something inside him. Life already gave me more time, he joked. I don't want to waste it worrying about things that don't matter. So he and Mom started traveling. Nothing extravagant. Small towns. National parks. Weekend trips. The kind of life they'd postponed for decades. And strangely enough, our family dinners became louder than ever. Not with arguments. With stories. Real stories. One evening, while we were eating at Mom's house, she disappeared into the hallway and returned carrying an old cardboard box. Look what I found. Photo albums. Report cards. Childhood drawings. Adrian laughed when he saw his ridiculous bowl haircut. I nearly fell off my chair when Mom revealed pictures of my braces phase. But then Dad paused on one picture. It showed Adrian and me sitting on the front steps of our old house. He was 12. I was 8. His arm wrapped protectively around me. Dad smiled. You know what I remember? What? Adrian asked. You used to fight anyone who teased your sister. Adrian blinked. I did. Oh yes, Mom laughed. There was that boy in 5th grade. Slowly, A smile appeared on his face. I forgot about him. I looked at my brother. No, you didn't. His eyes met mine. Maybe he hadn't forgotten. Maybe life had simply buried that version of him beneath expectations and insecurities. Dad closed the album gently. People think character is something you create, he said softly. But sometimes it's something you return to. Nobody spoke. Because somehow, we all understood. Adrian hadn't become someone new. He'd become someone he'd lost. And as laughter filled the room again, I realized something beautiful. The greatest gift life had given us wasn't success. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't even second chances. It was time. Time to become the people we should have been all along. Years passed. Not perfectly. Not without disagreements. But with honesty. And honesty changed everything. Mom stopped comparing people. Dad stopped measuring success by appearances. And Adrian stopped chasing applause. One Sunday afternoon, while helping Mom clean the garage, I found an old shoebox hidden behind dusty Christmas decorations. Inside were dozens of letters. Most of them were mine. Elementary school essays. Science fair certificates. Drawings de furguten exista. And beneath them all, folded carefully in a plastic sleeve, was a crayon picture I'd made when I was 7. It showed 4 stick figures holding hands. Mom, Dad, Adrian, and me. Above them, written in crooked letters, were the words, "My family always stays together." I laughed softly. Then I noticed tears running down Mom's cheeks. "You kept this?" I asked. She nodded. "Every single one." "But you never showed me." Her voice cracked. "I thought love was understood." She smiled sadly. "I didn't realize love needs to be seen." That sentence stayed with me. Love needs to be seen. Not assumed. Not hidden. Seen. That evening, Adrian came over for dinner. I showed him the drawing. He laughed. "Oh wow. You made me taller." "You were taller." He smiled. "No." He pointed to the picture. "I mean here." We both laughed. Then his smile softened. "You know something?" "What?" He touched the paper gently. "I spent years trying to become someone impressive." His eyes became emotional. "And all little Bella wanted was this." He pointed at the 4 stick figures. "A family." I smiled. "That's all I ever wanted." And as we sat there together, surrounded by old memories and quiet laughter, I realized something. Life had never given us a perfect family. It had given us something better. A broken one that chose, every single day, to heal. And maybe that kind of love is the strongest kind of all. A few months after finding that old drawing, I framed it. Not because it was beautiful. Honestly, it looked exactly like something a 7-year-old would create. Crooked stick figures. Uneven colors. Misspelled words. But every time I looked at it, I remembered something important. Little Bella had never dreamed about awards. She never imagined becoming a neurosurgeon. She didn't care about titles. All she wanted was to feel loved. To feel seen. To feel like she belonged. And somehow, after all the pain, all the misunderstandings, and all the years we spent pretending, we finally gave that little girl what she'd wanted all along. One evening, I stood on my apartment balcony watching the sunset when my phone buzzed. It was a group picture. Mom and Dad were smiling. Adrian was making some ridiculous face. Below it he had written, "Family dinner Sunday. Don't be late. Mom's making enough food to feed a small country." I laughed. Then another message appeared. "Dad, your mother says she misses you." A third message arrived immediately. "Mom, ignore him. I said we miss you." Asterisk asterisk. And finally, Adrian, same thing. "Love you, Bella." Asterisk asterisk. I stared at the screen and smiled. Not because life had become perfect. Because it hadn't. There were still hard days. Still old wounds. Still moments when healing felt like work. But that's what love really is. Not perfection. Not grand speeches. Not endless agreement. Love is choosing each other again and again, even after disappointment. And as I looked at that old childhood drawing hanging on my wall, I realized something. My brother's cruelty had never defined me. My family's blindness had never diminished me. And my silence had never made me small. Because people who truly love you don't need you to shrink. They celebrate your light. And if someone feels threatened by that light, it doesn't mean you should shine less. It means they need to learn how to see. So if you've spent years making yourself smaller to keep others comfortable, remember this. You don't have to scream to reclaim your worth. Sometimes all it takes is one honest truth. And once you stop shrinking, the people who truly love you will finally have the chance to see who you've been all along.